In the vast tapestry of Roman history, there are names woven in threads of glory and bronze. They are the heroes, the legends whispered in the streets and etched into the marble of monuments. But what happens when a hero's heart is a fortress of pride, unassailable even by the city he has sworn to protect? Close your eyes and journey back to the early days of the Roman Republic, a time of famine and fierce class struggles. Our story begins not in the halls of the Senate, but on the dusty plains of war, where a man named Gaius Marcius carved his legend in blood and steel. His name was not yet Coriolanus. He was a patrician, a nobleman, born with a fierce disdain for the plebeian commoners, who clamored for a share of Rome's power and its bread. His heart beat only for the glory of war, for the roar of battle, and the honor of a Roman victory. The city of Rome was suffering from a crippling grain shortage, a famine that stirred a bitter anger among the people. They saw the granaries of the patricians full, while their own bellies were empty. But the civil unrest was soon silenced by the more immediate threat of war. The Volscians, a rival tribe, were on the march, led by a great warrior named Tullus Aufidius. Lucius was the commander, but Marcius was the storm. In the siege of the Volscian city of Corioli, the Roman forces faltered. They were pushed back, their will to fight broken by the Volscian charge. It was then that Marcius, covered in blood and rage, rallied the troops. He was not a man of gentle words, but of fire. He charged into the gates of Corioli, almost alone, and fought with such ferocity that the Volscian defenders were terrified. Marcius opened the gates from within, allowing his legionaries to pour in and conquer the city. The Volscians were routed, and the city of Corioli fell. For his unparalleled bravery that day, the consul Cominius gave him a new name, an honorific that would echo through history. For your valor at Corioli, the consul proclaimed before the entire army, I give you the name Coriolanus. The cheers of the soldiers were thunderous, a testament to the respect and awe they held for this man. But as the cheers rang out, Coriolanus simply looked on, his face unmoved. He had won the name. But he had not won the hearts of the people he fought for. His victory was for Rome, but his pride was only for himself. The applause of the plebeians was as worthless to him as their votes. This arrogance, this fierce, unyielding pride, was the armor that would both define him and ultimately destroy him. A hero's return is a time of joy, a moment when a city unites under a banner of victory. But when Gaius Marcius, now Coriolanus, returned to Rome, the air was thick not with pure celebration, but with the dust of old resentments. He was the Lion of Corioli, a conquering general in a city still gripped by a desperate famine. The soldiers who fought with him cheered his name, but the plebeians, their faces gaunt from hunger, looked upon him with cold, suspicious eyes. Coriolanus, a man of fierce pride and unyielding honor, felt their contempt like a physical blow. He believed he had saved a city unworthy of his sacrifice. In his eyes, the people were nothing more than a rabble, undeserving of the grain that sat in the public granaries. His words, sharp and bitter, were spoken not to the common people, but to the fellow patricians in the Senate. Are we to be ruled by the demands of the mob? They ask for bread, but they offer nothing but their incessant complaints. Let them prove their worth on the battlefield, not in the marketplace. The conflict over the grain became the fire that would consume him. When a shipment of grain arrived from Sicily, The plebeians believed it should be distributed freely. But Coriolanus, incensed by their demands, argued that it should be sold at a high price. To give it away, he believed, would only empower their laziness and give them the right to question the rule of the Senate. His mother, Volumnia, a formidable and proud Roman matron, saw the danger in his arrogance. She was the one woman who could command his respect, a lioness who had raised a lion. His wife, the gentle Virgilia, looked on with a silent, growing dread. "My son, you have earned your glory in battle. Now you must earn your honor in the forum. The consulship is within your grasp, but you must humble yourself. Go to the people, show them your scars." According to tradition, a candidate for the consulship had to go to the forum and stand before the people, dressed in a simple toga, showing the scars of his battle wounds as proof of his service to Rome. But Coriolanus's pride was an unbreachable wall. To beg for their favor, to show his wounds to a people he despised, felt to him like an act of humiliation, not of humility. "My scars are my honor. They are not for the price of their worthless votes. I will not stand before them as a common beggar." Ignoring his mother's wise counsel, Coriolanus stormed into the forum. His speech was a torrent of rage, a scathing denunciation of the plebeians and their demands for power. He called them a diseased body, a rebellion that threatened to tear Rome apart. The tribunes of the people, a new office created to protect the commoners, listened with grim satisfaction. They now had all the evidence they needed. In a voice of solemn authority, one of the tribunes declared, "For his contempt of the people, his insults to the Republic, and his treasonous words, we sentence Gaius Marcius Coriolanus to perpetual exile from Rome." The forum, which had been silent in shock, erupted. The sound was not a celebration of justice, but a terrible, vengeful roar. Coriolanus, the conquering hero, was now an outcast. He stood on the steps, his face a mask of fury and betrayal, the roar of the crowd a deafening sound in his ears. He was a hero no longer, but a man alone, banished from the city he had saved. The applause for his victories had turned into a cry of condemnation, a betrayal he would not forget. The shame of exile is a heavy cloak, woven from the threads of public condemnation and private fury. For Gaius Marcius Coriolanus, that cloak was a constant torment. He was no longer a hero of Rome, no longer a proud patrician. He was a man with no name, a ghost walking the roads he had once conquered. His armor was gone, replaced by the simple, worn clothes of a traveler. But the fire of his rage burned hotter than ever. His journey was a silent, somber pilgrimage of betrayal. Every step he took away from Rome was a step closer to a new, terrible purpose. He had been a champion of the Republic, but the Republic had cast him out. He had fought for its honor, but it had stripped him of his own. In the cold, quiet nights, under the distant stars he once navigated by, his mind replayed the sound of the plebeians' roar, the venom in their cry of condemnation. It was a wound that would not heal, and the only balm for it was vengeance. His destination was not a city of allies, but of enemies. He was heading for Antium, the heartland of the Volscians. He was going to the very people he had conquered, to the very man whose life he had spared in battle, Tullus Aufidius, a man who knew what it felt like to be humbled by a Roman. It was in the dead of night that he arrived. The city was asleep, but the home of Tullus Aufidius, the great Volscian commander, was still. Lucius, his identity shrouded in a tattered cloak, slipped past the guards and found his way into the great hall. There, by the dim light of a hearth fire, sat Aufidius, a man hardened by war and a deep, simmering hatred for all things Roman. He looked up, his hand immediately on the hilt of his sword, his eyes sharp and wary. Aufidius did not recognize the man before him. He saw only a beggar, an intruder. But then, as Lucius threw back his hood, the firelight caught his features, and a flicker of shock crossed the Volscian's face. It was Coriolanus, the man who had defeated him at Corioli, the man who had taken his city. I'm here not as a Roman, but as a man wronged. I am Gaius Marcius. My name, Coriolanus, was given to me by a city that has now taken everything from me. I'm a ghost to them. I have no country, no wife, no home. I come to you, my former enemy, as an enemy of Rome. Aufidius listened, his hand slowly leaving his sword. He saw not a Roman general, but a man broken by his own people. He saw an asset. The two men, once locked in a bitter war, now stood in the silence of the hall, united by a common enemy. You were the sword of Rome. Now you are a blade without a hilt. What do you offer me? I offer you the sword. My skill, my knowledge of their weaknesses, my hatred of their arrogance. I will lead your armies. I will help you tear down the walls of the city that betrayed me. Aufidius rose from his seat, his face a mixture of triumph and caution. He extended a hand, not in friendship, but in a terrible, binding alliance. You have lost Rome, and in losing it, you have become its greatest enemy. Rise, Coriolanus, for today the Volscians have found a new general, and Rome has found its doom. The two men, a Roman exile and a Volscian general, shook hands over the glowing embers of the hearth. In that single, silent moment, the Republic's greatest hero was reborn as its most fearsome threat. He would return, not for glory, but for vengeance. The alliance between a Roman exile and a Volscian general was a seed of vengeance, and it grew into a harvest of terror. With the brilliance of a man who knew every weakness of his former home, Gaius Marcius Coriolanus transformed the Volscian army. He drilled them in Roman tactics, taught them Roman discipline, and infused them with a singular purpose: to march on Rome. The news of the Volscian advance reached the city like a cold wind. The stories of their victories in the Roman territories spread like wildfire. Town after town fell, and the name of the Volscian general was whispered in the forum and in the homes of the patricians. It was a name they all knew, a name they had once honored: Coriolanus. The man they had cast out had returned, not as a citizen, but as a conqueror. The proud city, which had never feared an external foe, was now gripped by a new kind of terror. The senators and the plebeians, who had been locked in bitter political feuds, were united in their fear. They looked at the great walls of Rome, not as a symbol of strength, but as a fragile boundary that a betrayed hero was determined to breach. In a desperate effort to avoid a siege, the Senate sent a delegation of distinguished men, friends of Coriolanus, his former comrades in arms, to the Volscian camp. They hoped to appeal to his patriotism, to the memory of the man who had saved the city at Corioli. But they were met with a man of ice. Coriolanus received them in silence, his face a mask of cold fury. He did not grant them a moment's audience, but through Tullus Aufidius, he sent back a single unyielding message: surrender all Roman territory or face annihilation. Next, a delegation of priests and holy men, clad in their sacred robes, came to the camp. They appealed to the gods, to the religious sanctity of the Roman people, and to the divine laws of forgiveness. Coriolanus listened to their pleas, but his heart was a stone. He saw not the will of the gods in their words, but the hypocrisy of a city that had used the gods to justify his exile. He sent them away with the same merciless demand. The city of Rome was out of options. The army was in no position to fight. The Senate had exhausted its diplomatic efforts, and the priests had failed. There was a final, desperate hope. It was a hope that had nothing to do with politics or military might, but everything to do with the heart of a man who was now a stranger to himself. In a quiet home on the Palatine Hill, the women of his family began their preparations. His mother, Volumnia, a woman of unyielding resolve. His wife, Virgilia, whose love had been a quiet haven in his life. And his young children, who knew their father only through the legends of his glory. They would be the final embassy, the final desperate plea to the man who had become a weapon of vengeance. They would go to the camp of the man who was now a fearsome enemy, in the hopes of appealing to the man who was once their son, husband, and father. The fate of Rome would rest not on the strength of its armies, but on the strength of a mother's plea. The fate of Rome, a city built on centuries of steel and sacrifice, was to be decided not by a battle, but by a family. In the center of the Volscian camp, surrounded by the very enemies he had once fought, stood Coriolanus. His face, once a proud Roman mask, was now a portrait of a man torn between two masters, his vengeful pride and the memory of his past. He watched as a small procession approached his command tent, a procession of women clad in robes of mourning and two small children. He saw his mother, Volumnia, the woman who had shaped his will, who had raised him to be a hero of Rome. Beside her was his gentle wife, Virgilia, her face etched with a silent sorrow, and at their side, his two young sons, their small hands clutching their mother's robes, their innocent eyes filled with confusion. Coriolanus's unyielding resolve, which had turned away senators and priests, began to crack. He had expected to see supplication, to feel the triumph of a man whose enemies begged for mercy. But his mother did not beg. She stood before him, her shoulders straight, and her eyes burning with a fierce light that reminded him of himself. "My son, you have marched on Rome as a conqueror. You have done so as a Volscian general. But do you not see? You stand here as the son of your mother, the husband of your wife, and the father of your children. You cannot conquer Rome without conquering us." She pointed to his wife, his children. "We will die on the walls of Rome before we ever surrender to its enemies. If you wish to enter the city, you must first march over the bodies of your own family." The words were not an argument for Rome. They were an argument for the man he once was. She spoke of the shame he would bring to his ancestors, of the name he would leave his children. The sight of his children, who looked at him with the innocence of boys who only saw a strong father, was a wound deeper than any he had received in battle. Coriolanus could not fight his mother's words. He had been a champion of honor, but his pride had led him down a path of dishonor. His vengeful rage, which had sustained him for so long, finally broke under the weight of a mother's love. He fell to his knees, his face in his hands, and wept. He was a Roman again, not of his own will, but because his family had held a mirror to his soul. He rose and with a heavy heart gave the order to his army, "Turn back." The Volscian forces, furious at this betrayal, watched in stunned silence as the conquering hero led them away from the gates of Rome. He had spared the city, but in doing so, he had sealed his own tragic fate. Tullus Aufidius, a man whose hatred for Rome was only matched by his ambition, could not forgive this act. He had used Coriolanus as a weapon, and now that weapon had turned on him. Later, in the quiet solitude of his tent, the Volscian warriors, incited by Aufidius's fury, fell upon the man who had become neither a Roman nor a Volscian. He died alone, a victim of his own tragic pride and a conflicting loyalty that had finally and fatally torn him apart. He had found his honor, but it cost him his life.